Good morning. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Hudson. My name is Marilyn Orr, President of the club, and we are thrilled to have you join us today. This meeting broadcast is available on HCTV, as well as our Rotary of Hudson YouTube channel and Facebook. Our club meets weekly using this digital platform, Zoom. When we meet in person, it's at Laurel Lake Retirement Community for breakfast. We hope to get back to that soon. We meet most Wednesday mornings from 7:15 to 8:30 a.m. So come out to join us for a meeting. We would love to have you as a guest. To learn more about Rotary, our club, and the impact we are having on our local community and the world, please visit our website, rotaryhudson.org. So enjoy this meeting today and help us share the message that Rotary opens doors of opportunity. Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Rotary Club of Hudson. Our invocation this morning is by Bill Wooldridge.
We should have Bill come to the computer.
Well, I can stand.
You know, it looks a lot
Morning,
better if you're
Rotarians.
sitting and we could see your face.
Oh, you want me to sit here so you can see my face? Is that a good
Yeah,
thing?
they'll be able to see you in the
Well, good morning,
auditorium on the big
Rotarians.
screen.
This is exciting.
There we go. There you go. Okay.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the privilege of living in a wonderful city in a country dedicated to freedom of speech, religion, and enterprise. For this, we are very thankful and appreciative. We ask your blessing on our Rotary Club and your guidance and support as we try to help those in need in our community of Hudson. Amen.
Thank you, Bill. And now to lead us in the pledge and four-way test, George Snyder.
You want me to sit up? All right. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And the four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Good luck.
Thank you, George. Before I turn this over to Pat, I need 2 volunteers to carry the Rotary banner in front of the truck for the Labor Day parade. So if there's 2 people that would like to walk in the parade, come see me after the meeting today. And also, oh, okay, Catherine, very good. And we'll find somebody else. But I know Chris said she would do it, and Chris and Catherine have done it many times in the past. So And the other thing I would like to say is I'd like to give special thanks to Nicole Kowalski for her designing the banner amidst many emails back and forth amongst people who had comments. And the banner looks very nice. She's done a very nice job. And I think everybody is happy with the way it turned out. And now our president, Pat Shearer.
Thank you very much. And I also want to echo Ron's thanks to Nicole in creating the banner by committee. So anytime you're trying to create something and you have a committee giving you feedback, it's always more of a challenge. So thank you very much for your work on that, Nicole. So our quote to start the day today: if you want to change the world, pick up your pen and write. Martin Luther. So a couple of announcements about upcoming things within the club. This Saturday at 9 o'clock at Ellsworth Hill Elementary School, we're going to be having a caring and taking care of our pollinator garden. So if any of you are available this Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, it should only be about an hour. We have a little care and pruning and some of those kind of things that we need to do at the pollinator garden to keep it going. The garden looks absolutely fantastic, and the principal and the kids, as they're starting to come back to school, are really going to appreciate it. But as we're getting this garden established, we need a couple set of hands on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock to help us do that. Want to thank Terry Bortnick for coming on board as our service chairperson for the club. So we appreciate you taking on that responsibility, Terry. In September, so it's not our next meeting next week, but starting in September, we'll be having the candidate series. So, and given the Delta variant, we're going to be not allowing the general public to come to the meeting itself, but they will be able to participate via Zoom. Rotarians will be allowed one guest to be brought to the meeting site. All right, so all Rotarians can bring one guest. Candidates will be able to bring 3 with them, but those that all of us that are Rotarians, you're allowed to bring one guest with you physically to the meeting. As many people as want to participate virtually can participate virtually. And with that, we'll introduce Jim Ahern to introduce our guest.
Thanks for being patient, Susan. That's kind of weird. Good morning. Good morning. Hey, it's no accident that Cleveland Heights is a national model of long-lasting racially diverse community. Because it was illegal to discriminate, residents of this early suburb challenged the pervasive pattern of housing segregation that dominated the region and their community. Between 1964 and 1975 or 76, they created 5 different organizations to address a community level, a social problem of national significance. They not only opened the closed community to Black residents, but they fought against pressures to reimpose segregation. It's an inspiring case study in the power of local activism. Our speaker and author of Resisting Segregation, Cleveland Heights activists shaped their community 1964 to 1976. I guess reminds me of the quote you just said. Yeah, if you have something to say, you want to get it done, you write something. Our speaker and author of that book lived in Cleveland Heights from 1979. And before she retired in 2008, directed a nonprofit citizen support organization for Cleveland Heights Public Schools. She's a city planner by training. She led the LWVO, that we'll probably know what that is, that acronym, advocacy work for public education, and writes the common good in the local newspaper. She and her husband have 2 grown children. Let's give a warm Rotary welcome to Susan Kaeser, sorry.
Good morning. Thanks a lot for having me. Writing this book was indeed a labor of love. It took me about 7 years to do it. But every minute of it was like being on a treasure hunt. I wanted to do the book in part because many of the people who led all the change during that era, I wanted to make sure I could interview them and get their experiences while they were still alive. You've stolen my opening remarks, but first let's put up the screen share here. Okay, here we go. Oops. Okay, I hope this is working. So I wrote the book, as he said. Well, it focuses on the period between 1964 and 1976. 1976 is when the city government finally responded to the activism that had transformed the community. At the time, in 1964, a group of women met in Barbara Roderick's living room to form the new organization's Heights Citizens for Human Rights. It led the charge for 10 years, but 4 other groups joined them over time. I chose the subtitle, Cleveland Heights Activists Shape Their Community, for a very specific reason. These activists were fed up with the real estate industry defining who lived in their community. White realtors were the gatekeepers, and they enforced segregation. The heroes of our city history wanted something different, and they demonstrated that the residents of a community can shape it to be inclusive and vibrant. I love Cleveland Heights. I moved here in 1979 to be part of something bigger, an integrated community, and I've never left. I wanted this book, first of all, I wanted to celebrate and acknowledge the work of the people who had built our community. I wanted to make sure that today's residents and those who join us in the future know our history and are inspired to continue to contribute to its success. I wanted to raise the visibility and reputation of Cleveland Heights, which is always subject to disrespect, in fact, because of its greatest asset, it's being integrated. And I wanted to affirm, above all else, the value of working on big issues at the community level and the power of organized citizens to make real change, to promote, in fact, a social revolution. This form of activism is how to make progress on almost every important issue. This is Gerda Friedheim, the spark plug behind much of the housing work that brought African Americans to Cleveland Heights in the 1960s. She was instrumental, and she proclaimed in our interview that it was an exhilarating time, and their focus was to eliminate a blight on our society, and they were successful. When the people in this story went to work to end segregation, they had no roadmap on how to do it, no financial support, and no laws to back them up. They were volunteers who had a strong moral compass, moral authority, voices, determination, time, and each other, perhaps like the Rotary Club. It turns out these resources are powerful. By standing up and speaking out, they ended tacit approval of discrimination, supported courageous African Americans who moved into their community. They challenged and changed the behavior of realtors and lenders who were instrumental in imposing and maintaining segregation. They helped make enforcement of the law, once laws were passed, they helped make enforcement possible, and they changed community attitudes so that social change could happen and segregation would not take place again. They also effectively changed political leadership, which enabled a new role for city government. This is the top of the hill, the entryway into Cleveland Heights. I want to talk a little bit about our history. So we know Cleveland was settled late in the 1700s, and for most of the 19th century, the population of Cuyahoga County grew in the city of Cleveland. But at the turn of the 20th century, the pattern of suburban living began. And it began in 3 suburbs: East Cleveland, Lakewood, and Cleveland Heights. In 1900, 96% of the population of Cuyahoga County lived in Cleveland, as did 98% of the African-American population. By 1960, the period that I'm looking at, the city was home to only 53% of the population of Cuyahoga County, but for African-Americans, 98% of the population was in the city. African-Americans were excluded from suburbanization, creating a widely segregated region. So this table really kind of tells the story of Cleveland Heights in a nutshell. In 1910, between 1910 and 1930, the population, basically, that was a rapid change in the population. That's when most of Cleveland Heights was developed. The population peaked in 1960, the period that we're looking at, and started to decline at that point and has continued to decline ever since. Most of the Black population that lived in Cleveland Heights at the time, between 1910 and 1960, were domestic servants. And Mark Souther, professor at Cleveland State, has documented this part of the population. And it's interesting, by 1960, it was the smallest, the Black presence was the smallest in the history of the community, except in 1910. Only 0.4% of the population of the city was African-American. But by 1970, that had increased to 2.5%. And then there was a rapid change between 70 and 80, when it increased to 24%. And since then has been incrementally inching up. But the rapid change that was expected to turn, the standard understanding in planning is that once a community integrates, it only lasts for 5 years. Cleveland Heights defies that whole theory. And the period we're looking at here between 60 and 70 is when, because of the active efforts of these 5 groups, African-Americans actually moved into Cleveland Heights. And then because of their work between after that, they helped prevent that surge turning into a complete turnover. On May 14th, 1963, in the middle of the children's campaign in Birmingham, Martin Luther King came to Cleveland Heights to Cleveland to raise funds for the civil rights movement. This is a photograph of Dr. King at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Cleveland Heights. And Taylor Branch, the King historian, called this the first white mass meeting of the civil rights movement. Many Cleveland Heights residents who were sympathetic to the movement were in the audience. They didn't at that time have a focus for their own activism, but they were very, very concerned. And I include this because it's important to know that the civil rights movement really did inspire people in communities across the country to take action, including Cleveland Heights residents. In Cleveland at that point in 1963, leaders there focused on the segregation in the public schools in Cleveland and overcrowding in the Glenville neighborhood. Because of housing segregation, African-Americans were limited to only a few parts of the city, and only the city. So the overcrowding was extreme, and it produced overcrowding in the public schools. There was the United Freedom Movement was a coalition of about 50 organizations. It attracted many Cleveland Heights activists who supported efforts to try and find a solution to this overcrowding that did not create segregation. The school district had done intact busing, which was moving kids, whole classrooms of Black children, into white schools, but not integrating them within the schools, and it was horrendous. Finally, the school district decided to build more schools in the Glenville neighborhood. So they decided to perpetuate segregation. And this was an action that actually was part of the desegregation case that proved evidence of intent to segregate. Pictured here is Reverend Bruce Klunder, who was a Cleveland Heights resident and a minister at University Circle. And he was part of a group that demonstrated at the construction site of one of these schools and was killed. This was an incredibly important moment for activists. And Cleveland Heights, the Cleveland Heights activists who were part of this Cleveland movement just understood that they were part of the problem. The segregation of their all-white suburb was contributing to the lack of options for African Americans, and this had to change. Joan Dowling was one of the people who was at one of those demonstrations, and she was really the first, she was a real pioneer in activism to make change. And two things that she did as a Cleveland Heights resident was to focus on the school district, because she was a parent of, she had 5 kids in the school district. She wanted their kids to have integrated experiences and not wait for integration of the whole region. She convinced our school board, which was a responsive school board, to open up summer school to Black kids from Cleveland. And it was a very successful effort. She also, along with, I think, 250, she had a petition drive, convinced the school board to rewrite their human relations policy in recognition that racial change was going to come to the school district, and they needed to honor all the students that came to their school district. And it's interesting that one feature of their policy was that it encouraged discussion of difficult issues. Phyllis Brodie was another one of these, of the women really, who led this charge. And she was one of the people that, the workhorses that always gets things done. And this personal crisis and the moral concern is what drove so many people who were involved in this movement. These are the 5 groups that came into being, for some for short term, some for long. They each were founded in different ways, and they focused, and at different times, and they focused on different issues. Or different elements of maintaining integration. But they're the focus of this group. I'm only going to give you a little bit of information about each of them, but it took this, united effort on many fronts to actually have inroads into this difficult problem. There were also a number of regional organizations that came into being after the passage of the, after fair housing legislation passed in the State House and at the federal level. And these regional fair housing groups were really important to changing the whole housing market. And they worked in close partnership with the Cleveland Heights groups. When I found the summary of the King years, I realized that this is exactly the story that I was studying. Citizens and leaders can work miracles together despite every hardship against great odds. When Cleveland Heights activists decided to take on the real estate industry and the cultural traditions of housing segregation and white supremacy, they had chosen seemingly insurmountable odds. So to fully appreciate the significance of their work, it's important to understand what the barriers were that they were fighting. That included the attitudes that justified segregation, the historic depth of those ideas, the scale of the problem, and how segregation was institutionalized in law. So let me run through these. The first barrier was expressed by Kermit Lynn, who was a longtime activist in fair housing and was one of my primary informants for this project. First of all, the real estate industry did not see integration as a legitimate option. They didn't believe in it. They both worked to prevent it, or once it took root, they worked to undermine it. The white establishment was happy with the status quo. This is the groundbreaking at Severance Shopping Center, and the mayor of Cleveland Heights in 1966 is the second person from the right. And he was both first ignored the change that was before him and then fought it. And he was very critical of the activists. This helps kind of capture the scale of the problem. As I had said before, in 1910, 90% of all residents of Cuyahoga County lived in the suburbs. And by 2000, we see it's 34%. But by 1960, almost half of the population had moved to the suburbs. but that was not true for African Americans. And the first change really began to happen between 1960 and 1970. This is let's see. This is a residential security map that was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1939. This is a map of Cuyahoga County. And in 1939, as part of the New Deal, the Congress passed two important bills to improve to help save homeowners from foreclosure and also to stimulate the economy by putting people to work building new housing. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation wanted to make sure that the federal government didn't make any faulty loans, so they wanted to assess risk. So teams in 254 communities across the country used the same set of criteria to determine risk. And any area that had the presence of African Americans or where there was mixed use, where industry and housing were close together, which was the nature of housing in urban centers, would be denied any kind of financial assistance from the federal government. And so this is what created a huge incentive against integration. And it helped to create the pattern of widespread segregation that endured that endures today in some ways. Part of the criteria was using this desirability index. Homer Hoyt was the person who oversaw this whole evaluation of risk. And the eugenics movement, which had been long discredited by the 1930s, this was their notion of who was a desirable ethnic group. And this very much influenced the way in which they assessed risk. Another significant barrier were these, the prejudices expressed were highly held towards African Americans. And it's a heartbreaking list in my perception. Another barrier was intimidation and restrictive covenants. So some communities passed laws that prohibited the sale of property to African Americans. But in some places like Cleveland Heights, when integration began, harassment began against African Americans moving into the community. And in Cleveland Heights, there were about 7 different incidents between 1964 and 1974. The first one happened to the Coolies. Then, interestingly, in 1965, on the same night, 2 different places were bombed 10 minutes apart. Then this home was first bombed in 1966 when the white owners put it up for sale with a fair housing real estate firm. And then it was bombed again when the next year when the new African American owner moved in. In 1969, Isaac Haggins opened a real estate firm in Cleveland Heights. He was an African American, and his business was bombed. I want to say that each time these acts of aggression took place, the Heights Citizens for Human Rights would hold a rally in support of those who had been offended. And so the intimidation actually backfired. It helped to reveal how people were opposed to violence and supported, in fact, the integrative moves. The first organization that I mentioned was Heights Citizens for Human Rights, and they expected integration to occur, and their goal was to facilitate that integration and to make sure that it was accepted. They had a number of strategies, but one important one was to actually find homeowners who were willing to sell their property to a Black buyer. Realtors, white realtors, basically only served white sellers and white buyers, so they couldn't be counted on. So Heights Citizens had a whole network of people who watched out for people who were selling their homes without a realtor. And they also combed the newspaper looking for those people. And then they would approach them and ask them if they were willing to sell to a Black buyer. And slowly but surely, they would find a few people at a time who would be willing to do this. Another important activity was accompanying African-American buyers as they would go to a potentially hostile open house or effort to view a home that was for sale. So this was really painstaking work. They had a set of volunteers that did this every week, but it was the key to actually not just preparing for or encouraging integration, they actually created it and helped build it. Another really important activity that they had, it was a massive project. In 1967, they held living room meetings throughout the community. They held 50 of these living room meetings where a volunteer would facilitate a discussion about race, about racial change, about racial anxiety, and really helped people understand that flight and resegregation were not an automatic outcome if they decided to just not move or not be intimidated. And so it was a very, to me, this is kind of the power of the person-to-person voice and why they were so effective, because they took the time to do that kind of outreach and organizing, which was the power that they had. And if you've ever organized a meeting, you know how hard it is to really pull off something good. Well, they pulled off 50 of them. So these are some of the key strategies. It was a lot of both finding houses, welcoming new African-American residents, organizing street meetings, and basically talking to each other. This is a picture of Forest Hills Church, and it's a Presbyterian church in Cleveland Heights. And in the 1960s, the Presbyterian Church USA undertook and urged each of its congregations to address the issue of race and to end racism within their denomination. And the mission, the mission of the Presbyterian Church at Forest Hill, they embraced fair housing and condemned discrimination. This was the first thing they did. Reverend Ned Edwards came to join the staff in 1963, and he was in charge of youth education and adult education. And over the next 3 years, he organized month-long congregation studies on race and racism. And they had exchanges with Black congregations. They had extensive workshops, but they were really trying to work on their own biases and racism. And after 3 years of this, they took action and they started the Forest Hill Church Housing Corporation. They understood that one of the most important things about making integration work in their community was to make sure that the new homeowners were able to maintain their property. This is where the property value issue people felt was real, but the problem wasn't who owned it, it was whether or not they could maintain it. And they, at the time, by then, Cleveland Heights housing was aged. There were unscrupulous homeowners who were willing to sell a faulty product. There was no code enforcement to make sure properties were brought up to standards. And new homeowners who had been denied access to mortgages were going to have few resources left to invest in their properties. So creating this organization was critical to stable integration. And it's an organization that is still in, operates in Cleveland Heights and has a huge role in making sure that Cleveland Heights maintains property values. The Committee to Improve Community Relations was an African-American parent group, and it was created not as a separate organization, but to serve the special interests of Black families so that we're moving into a previously all-white community. And their role was incredibly important. They understood that the institutions of this community were not used to serving a Black population, and that they would have to fight for and advocate for the interests of their own interests if suburban living was going to turn into the was going to give them the rewards that they had moved to the community to enjoy. This is Doris Allen and her family. Her children were frequently harassed, and she stood up, and she was one of the people that helped to form the Committee to Improve Community Relations. She worked at the Heights Y and as the youth program director, and she witnessed one day a gang of white boys coming in with baseball bats and metal bars and beating up the Black kids at the Heights Y. This was appalling to her, but really what bothered her was when the police arrived, how little, how they didn't take it seriously and just released the white kids without any action. And that's really what stimulated her to call her friends together to create CICR. One of the things that they took very seriously was being able to turn out 10 Black men within 10 minutes in case of any kind of an incident. And this was a way of fighting stereotypes that only that Black men were disengaged and that all the Black women were the dominant force in the community. This is Bernice Lott, who was one of the founders and also a wonderful activist who worked in all kinds of organizations. And she was our first Black elected official. She joined the school board in 1974. One of the most important contributions of CICR was that they filed a complaint with the Department of Justice in 1973, trying to gain better services for Black children in the high school. The high school students wanted a recognition day for Black achievement. They were upset with racist behavior by both students and teachers, discipline code. They were being counseled to only take low-level courses, a litany of problems. And in April of 1974, they won their suit. And one of the most important things that they were looking for was to improve the percentage of teachers who were minorities. And over the next 20 years, the school district reported back to CICR about progress towards reaching that goal of improving the presence of minority teachers in the school staff. A very short-term organization was the St. Anne Audit Committee. In 1971, the Catholic Diocese started something called Action for a Change. They did a diocesan-wide, another kind of study program for people to learn about social justice issues. And then at the end of their 6-week course, they were to design a project to take action. And 5 women from St. Anne's Parish in Cleveland Heights decided to focus on whether or not realtors were complying with fair housing law. Were they discriminating or not? And during the audit that they conducted in 1972, they found significant evidence of violations of the federal law. They shared those findings with the city council and with all the real estate firms that did business in Cleveland Heights, but they chose not to file suit because at that point, it was the fair housing laws were untested and they didn't know if they would be successful. They didn't have money for a lawsuit, but they knew by just sharing and educating realtors, they could begin to make change. So a significant development. And it proved that fair housing, even though integration had taken place, that it was vulnerable to the continued pressure by realtors to push for resegregation. This is the Cleveland Heights High School Choir in 1968, preparing for a Hanukkah concert. At the time, 65% of the students at Heights High were Jewish. By 1971, the Black presence had begun, and in the middle here we have our gospel choirs. And I think these 2 pictures just kind of captured that racial change had started, and it had started with racial tension. There was a serious fight in January 1973 at the high school, and the superintendent of schools was really upset, and he called a community meeting and said, the problem here is racism, and I can't solve that by myself. We need the community to step up. So religious leaders, there were 16 different Jewish institutions in Cleveland Heights at the time, 4 different Catholic parishes, 4 Catholic schools, 3 parishes, and a monastery. And this is the Carmelite monastery. And the priest who was located at that monastery, Father Bonnell, pulled together a meeting in the monastery of representatives of these 2 distinct religious groups to figure out how can they respond to segregation. They were very frustrated by the lack of leadership by the community leaders to actually deal with it, and figured out what really needed to happen is the school district, the city, and every organization in town needed to get on board to fight efforts to resegregate the community and to also build a much stronger community where residents felt ownership and a deep commitment. And this led to the creation of this, the Heights Community Congress. These were the participants in the Heights Action Committee. And in 1973, the Congress received a grant from the Cleveland Foundation. It was the first funded project, and they had 9 different staff members who held 30 to 40 meetings a week, solving all kinds of issues in the community. And that was the beginning of the Heights Community Congress. They had multiple ways in which they contributed, both around fair housing and generally solving problems and doing neighborhood organizing. They collected serious evidence of how lenders were also discriminating. They influenced federal policy. They issued it, they finally had a lawsuit challenging the realtors on the fair housing law, and were actually the test case in the fair housing law. So the Heights Community Congress really, that was the final. By then, Heights Citizens for Human Rights basically faded away, and the Congress took over its role and expanded it, and then went on for 40 years to be the voice for fair housing. The director of the Congress was this great guy, Harry Fagan, who was a wonderful organizer and had a lot to do with the success of the Congress. They had a number of activities, including they had a housing service very much like Heights Citizens, where they would accompany people looking for housing and basically marketed the community to anybody who was interested in moving here. Finally, in 1976, after years of city leaders being indifferent or hostile, they really finally got on board, recognizing that integration had become a really important asset of our community. And they put the full power of city government behind making sure housing was maintained, that discrimination was not tolerated, and that realtors were rewarded for marketing the community. And so that's really the resolution point and the ending point of my story, because it really was the turning point. And since then, really we've sustained this wonderful integration that drew me to the community in the first place and makes me such a proud member of my community. So I haven't done justice to these groups at all. I hope you'll read my book because all the details are in there. Cleveland Landmarks Press is the publisher. It's the publisher is a wonderful guy that lives in the community. So thank you so much for having me.
Any questions for Susan?
Hi, Susie. Thank you for an excellent history. Absolutely didn't know, most of what you shared with us today. So appreciate you opening my eyes.
Good.
Can you talk a little bit about how you feel segregation exists today in Cleveland Heights, and some things that people are doing currently and some things that we should be focusing on to help prevent segregation?
I would say that, first of all, the new census data came out, and what makes me happy is that we continue to be a stable, integrated community. There's a slight increase in the Black population after it dipping between 2000 and 2010. And we continue to have a smaller white population, and we have a growing Asian and Latino population. So we continue to be a vibrant, diverse community. There are neighborhoods in the community that are less integrated than others. There are streets that are less integrated than others, but overall we maintain as an integrated community. I think, you know, the real test is, are buyers interested and are buyers of any race interested in every street? And I think we've been able to show that people will continue to move here regardless of their race. But that doesn't mean that we haven't been hurt. Like the housing bubble and predatory lending in 2008 really was damaging, and our Black residents were preyed upon in that way. So I think our community continues to be vulnerable to the forces that do try to that discriminate against African Americans. So I believe that while it may be ideal to have, I think integration is hard to define. So as far as I'm concerned, we have a diverse population that lives throughout our community, and it continues to be successful, and it continues to be a challenge to always be, we always have to be working to recruit people to our community, to engage them, to make them feel ownership, and to really, I think one of the things that really helps is we have wonderful community resources that make it an attractive place to be.
Any other questions for Susan? Jim?
Thanks again, Susan, for showing up. I really appreciate it. Very interesting. I just have one question. When you have now you have some time to look back over hindsight to what happened in those years. And if there was a community from anywhere in the country that would come and say, hey, tell us the one thing you think was the most impactful action that you could take or start with, what would it be?
Oh, you know, it's interesting. There are people who are expert on this, and I recently read an article where they said most communities are integrating and are moving towards resegregation, and they don't have a clue about what to do, but they should ask Cleveland Heights. And so I'm very, I think the most important thing is for people to organize as a group. You can't do this alone. So it was the organized voice that was important, and it was basically deciding that you want integration, and you figure out whatever strategy you can to build confidence in that as an option. So I don't, you know, it's almost like just decide to do it is the most important part of doing it.
We have time for one more question if anybody has one for Susan. All right, no question. Thank you very much, Susan, for your great presentation this morning.
Thanks so much for having me. This really means a lot, and I think it's very relevant to today and where we are trying to suppress any discussion of race. What made this work was open discussion of race and an affirmation that you can make life better for everybody. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you again, Susan. So Evan leans over to me during the presentation today and he goes, Pat, what year were you born? And I said 1969, and he goes, just think this all has taken place while you've been alive. So you think about how far we've come in 52 years. We still have a long way yet to go, but we've been able to make some significant inroads in the last 52 years, and we got a lot more to go in the next 52 to get there too. And thank you, Evan, for making sure that I realize that I'm getting old. So, all right. So we have our drawing this morning. It's a big payout. It's $5. And we'll let the young guy pick the ticket because he can probably read the numbers.
716-40 716-406.
Oh, it's Kelly. No, no winner of the jackpot. So thank you, Kelly. Just a reminder that this Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, we'll be gathering up at Ellsworth Hills to do a little maintenance on our pollinator garden. So please come out and bring your gardening tools with you. And the more hands we have, the faster it will go. All right. Favorite part of the Rotary meeting. Why do dogs make terrible dance partners? They have 2 left feet. And we are adjourned.